8 political paradoxes that affect you and your vote. Politics is complex, that's a given, but if you look closely, you'll see that it is also filled with many contradictions that challenge our beliefs about fairness, representation, and democracy itself. Known as political paradoxes, these are the sorts of mental exercises that, once you see them, become almost impossible to ignore. In this video, we'll discuss 8 such paradoxes and demonstrate how they expose the limits of both ideologies and policies. Will your political beliefs stand up to the challenge? What are political paradoxes, and why do they matter? Political paradoxes often appear when there's a contradiction between theory and reality in political systems or processes. That is, they tend to arise when expected outcomes clash with real-world results. This indicates that the systems we often use to simplify information or decision-making could be inherently flawed. These paradoxes matter because they bring attention to unintended consequences in political structures. But rather than being purely negative, they help to spark discussions that encourage us to rethink how governance and politics can better match up with the complexity of life and human nature. Keeping that in mind, let's look at some of the most important political paradoxes experts have identified. The Alabama Paradox. One of the earliest examples of a political paradox comes from the 1880 U.S. Census, specifically the distribution of seats in the House of Representatives. At the time, the state of Alabama had 8 seats out of 299. But when Congress considered adding a 300th seat to the House, Alabama inexplicably lost 1 seat despite it suffering no change in population. This occurrence, known as the Alabama Paradox, highlights the unpredictability of apportionment, the term used for the way seats or resources are allocated based on population. The added seat altered the overall distribution in a way that disadvantaged Alabama, adequately demonstrating how even the most straightforward adjustments can lead to surprising and unfair outcomes. In short, it shows that fairness isn't always so fair. Arrow's impossibility theorem. From a democratic standpoint, the idea of voting is about as fair as you can expect. One person gets 1 vote, meaning that each person's political preferences are directly represented in the final outcome. At least, that's how you would think it would work. But economist Keith Arrow discovered a challenging paradox in voting systems. Now known as Arrow's impossibility theorem, it shows that no voting system can perfectly translate individual preferences into a collective decision without compromising the very fairness the system attempts to uphold. Take the 2000 US election, for example. There were 3 candidates running: Bush, Gore, and Nader. Many Nader supporters were torn, as they knew that voting for him could inadvertently help Bush by taking votes away from Gore. When you have 3 or more candidates, it's impossible to construct an outcome where all individual voter preferences are represented. This is also known as the spoiler effect and serves to explain why attempts to reform voting often prove so difficult. The Condorcet Paradox. Here is yet another example of how preferences and voting interact. It's called the Condorcet Paradox, and it occurs when a group's collective preferences form a cycle, eventually evolving into a loop with no clear winner. Imagine a city council voting on 3 projects. Project A is a new park. Project B is school funding. Project C is a series of road improvements. Let's say Group 1 prefers A over B and B over C, while Group 2 prefers B over C and C over A. Finally, Group 3 prefers C over A and A over B. This circle of preference creates a pattern with no stable majority. And since the democratic process is all about appeasing the majority, this paradox reveals just how flawed outcomes can be, even when each individual's preferences are consistent. Essentially, majority rule can sometimes fail to provide a coherent decision, leading to situations in which all 3 groups are disappointed. The prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a classic paradox derived from game theory. This is a field of mathematics that analyzes situations in which individuals, or players, make decisions that affect each other. In many cases, it shows how individuals acting in their self-interest can end up in a worse situation than if they had cooperated. During the Cold War, for example, the US and the Soviet Union each feared the other's nuclear capabilities, resulting in a costly arms race. In this case, the players had 2 choices. They could agree to disarm or continue building more weapons. As we know all too well, both opted for the latter. Had both nations chosen to disarm, they could have achieved greater security and lower costs. However, due to mutual distrust, both continued stockpiling weapons, resulting in heightened tension and financial strain. This paradox illustrates the difficulties of achieving cooperation in competitive, high-stakes situations. It also translates into public policy, where mutual trust and collective action could lead to better outcomes for everyone. The paradox of voting. The paradox of voting, also known as Downs' paradox, questions why people vote when their single vote is unlikely to affect the outcome, especially in a large election. Logically, the time and effort involved in voting may seem pointless, especially in national elections, where one vote rarely changes the result. Despite this, millions still vote due to a sense of duty, civic pride, or social pressure. This paradox reveals the psychological and social motivations behind voting, which go beyond simple cost-benefit analysis. It is simultaneously complicated by the fact that if everyone were to choose not to vote, then the entire process would cease to work. The TV show South Park hilariously illustrated this in its Season 8, Episode 8 parody of the upcoming American election. Tyranny of the majority. This brings us to another major criticism of the democratic process, the so-called tyranny of the majority. Here's a great example. In Switzerland in 2009, there was a referendum that banned the construction of new Islamic prayer towers. Despite opposition from religious minorities and human rights groups, the referendum passed. Despite being a democracy, Switzerland's majority was able to infringe on minority rights. Thinkers like James Madison and Alexis de Tocqueville recognized this threat early on, which is why they advocated for systems of checks and balances to prevent majorities from imposing harmful policies on minorities. Nevertheless, it seems that no number of safeguards can prevent it from happening today. The liberal paradox. It may surprise many to learn that the term liberal actually refers to people focused on individual liberty, equality, and democratic government. Most people living in a democracy will agree that these are all good things. However, that hasn't prevented the development of the liberal paradox. To explain this properly, we can look at this 2010 law from France, which banned full face coverings, including the burqa and niqab, in public spaces. Proponents of the bill argued it was necessary for public safety and upholding secular values. However, opponents saw it as an infringement on individual freedom, particularly for Muslim women. This situation illustrates the liberal paradox at work. Amartya Sen described it as a sort of tension between individual freedom and collective welfare. While liberal societies aim to uphold personal freedoms, conflicts can arise when those freedoms are perceived to challenge societal norms or values. The voting paradox of redistribution. Here's yet another ballot-related paradox. To properly illustrate the voting paradox of redistribution, we can look at California's Proposition 13, passed in 1978. The law capped property taxes and limited increases, which initially appealed to homeowners as it protected them from rising tax rates. However, over time, it led to reduced funding for public services like schools and infrastructure. These side effects ended up impacting everyone, including the voters who supported the bill, reflecting the dilemmas that often creep up between revenue distribution and tax policy. Oftentimes, policies that provide immediate benefits for voters can sometimes undermine broader economic sustainability and public welfare. Conclusion. Political paradoxes like these reveal the unpredictable and sometimes contradictory nature of governance, offering lessons about the complexities involved in designing fair, functional systems. These paradoxes remind us that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences, and that democracy and representation aren't as straightforward as they might seem. By understanding these paradoxes, we can approach politics with a more critical eye and a broader understanding of the implications of our choices. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like and share it with someone who's passionate about politics. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights that challenge the way we see the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.